The mud was a living thing, a cold, thick substance that swallowed a man's boots with a wet, sucking sound, clinging to the leather and canvas as if unwilling to let go. It was a physical weight, a constant burden on the tired bodies of the men who inhabited the trenches of the Macedonian Front in September 1918. The air, heavy and damp, carried the faint metallic scent of rust and the acrid smell of stale sweat. A low, persistent wind moaned across the desolate landscape, a sound as mournful as any human cry, a backdrop to the endless silence. For Lieutenant Dimitar Petrov, the mud was more than a nuisance. It was a metaphor. It was the clinging reality of a war that refused to end, a grim testament to the decay that had seeped into everything he knew. At 30 years old, he was not a soldier by nature, but a professor of letters, and his body reflected a life spent hunched over books. He was tall but slender, with shoulders that sloped forward, and his thin-rimmed glasses constantly slipped down his narrow nose, a small, persistent indignity. His hands, delicate and long-fingered, were better suited to turning the pages of a novel than gripping the cold, unyielding wood of a rifle. He wore the M1899 Bulgarian uniform, dark blue collar and cuffs with red piping, and he made a futile effort to keep it clean, brushing away the mud from the knees of his trousers, a small, desperate act of defiance against the surrounding filth. Beside him, Private Ivan was a different kind of man entirely. At 18, he was all calloused hands and wide, fearful eyes, the kind of peasant boy who had been born with dirt under his nails and the sun on his back. He did not care for the politics of empire or the historical claims of his nation. He cared only for the farm he had left behind and the family who were waiting for him to return. The war had taken the light from his eyes, leaving them as hollow and vacant as the trench they occupied. Lieutenant Atanas watched them both with a cold, simmering disdain. A career officer, Atanas saw the world in clean, brutal lines of duty and honor, and he had no patience for Dimitar's nervous tics or Ivan's simple, obvious fear. His jaw was set, his posture rigid, a living monument to the military machine he served. His uniform, though as battered as any other, seemed to wear him, not the other way around. He was the antithesis of Dimitar, the physical manifestation of the war's soulless purpose. For weeks, the Macedonian Front had been a place of brutal stagnation. The initial swift campaigns of the war were a distant memory, replaced by a wearying war of attrition. Whispers of an Allied breakthrough at Dobropol had been circulating, rumors carried on the wind like a silent disease. The High Command insisted the front was stable, a fragile lie they repeated as if speaking it out loud would make it true. But the men knew. They felt the unease in the way their officers' eyes darted nervously from side to side, in the tightening of their rations, in the low, nervous energy that hummed through the trench, a prelude to a storm. The feeling was universal. The army was a hollow shell, and it could not hold. The order came in a clipped, urgent tone. Patrol, reconnaissance, to the Serbian line. The words cut through the tired air like a whip. Atanas's eyes narrowed, a glint of cruel satisfaction in them. He would lead it, of course, but he chose his companions with a quiet malice. Dimitar and Ivan, the professor and the boy, the two men he considered the weakest links. Dimitar's heart seized, a cold fist in his chest. His hands began to tremble, and he fought the urge to grip them together, to still their frantic shaking. He was no stranger to fear, but this was a different kind. It was the fear of leaving the mud and the stagnation for the place where the war still lived, where the stories of atrocities were not just whispers, but screaming truths. The only thing that kept him from unraveling was the small leather-bound book tucked into his jacket pocket, his diary. the pages he filled each night were his bulwark against the madness, his final attempt to make sense of a world gone insane. The weight of it was a physical burden, yet it was also his only anchor. It was the only way he could carry his mission, to ensure the innocent would not be forgotten. They left the trench under the fading light of a bruised sky. The wind had picked up, a sharp, cold breath that bit at their exposed skin. The sound of distant artillery, a low guttural rumble, rattled the ground beneath their feet, a reminder that even in this quiet moment, the earth itself was a battlefield. The smell of gunpowder, faint but distinct, was a taste in the back of their throats. Ivan's face was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. Atanas marched on, his back a rigid, unyielding line. Dimitar followed, his mind already miles away, haunted by a past that was about to collide with a present far more brutal than he could ever have imagined. He was a man of words and ideas, now walking into a world where only bullets and blood mattered. The egregore of war had finally claimed him, and there was no turning back.
The land changed as they moved beyond the trenches. The terrain, once a scarred, moon-like expanse of churned earth and jagged wire, gave way to a desolate, bruised landscape of burnt-out villages and skeletal forests. The wind, which had moaned over the battlefield, now whispered through the empty window frames of destroyed farmhouses, a sound that carried the echo of 1,000 silent screams. The smell of damp soil and gunpowder was replaced by the acrid scent of charred wood and decay, a smell that clung to their clothes and hair, a constant reminder of the war's cruel, creeping advance. Dimitar felt the weight of it all settle over him, heavier than the mud on his boots. This was a land not of conflict, but of a monstrous, final silence. They walked for hours, their breath a white vapor in the cold air. Private Ivan, his shoulders hunched, kept his eyes on the ground as if fearing what might leap out from the shadows. Lieutenant Atanas, however, strode with purpose, his movements sharp and deliberate, as if trying to impose order on a world that had none. His rifle, a German Gewehr 98, was held with practiced ease, an extension of his will. They came upon a small village that seemed untouched. The houses stood straight, their windows unbroken. A wisp of smoke curled from a single chimney. It was a perfect, unsettling picture, a jarring island of peace in a sea of destruction. Atanas's posture stiffened. "Check the houses," he ordered, his voice low. "Split up." Dimitar's heart hammered against his ribs. He moved toward a small farmhouse, the wooden door slightly ajar. The silence was unnatural, an absence of sound so complete it felt like a pressure on his eardrums. He pushed the door open, the wood groaning in protest. The air inside was still and smelled of stale bread and mold. On a small wooden table, a half-eaten bowl of soup sat beside a chipped ceramic cup, a silent testament to a meal interrupted in a hurried panic. The sight twisted something in Dimitar's stomach. People had lived here moments ago, fled. He imagined the feel of the rough wooden table beneath his fingertips, the warmth of the cup, the frantic scramble to escape. He put his hand on the table, feeling only cold, dead wood. A faint sound, a muffled cough, came from the cellar. Dimitar froze. He looked back at the open door, then at his own trembling hands, and finally at the small leather diary in his pocket. It felt like a stone, a source of both immense weight and immense strength. He drew his pistol and slowly moved toward the trapdoor in the floor. As he opened it, a wave of cold, musty air rushed up to meet him. In the gloom, illuminated by the single shaft of light from above, was a family. A man, an older woman, and a young girl, their faces etched with terror. The man, with a graying beard and kind, tired eyes, was holding a small leather-bound book. Dimitar's breath caught in his throat. It was a book of poems, its pages worn from years of use. In that instant, Dimitar saw not an enemy, but a reflection of himself, a man who found solace in words, who held on to culture in a world of chaos. The Serbian man was a teacher, his face a map of the same quiet desperation Dimitar felt every day. The terror in his eyes was not for himself, but for the woman and the child beside him. Then a wave of nausea. The air in the cellar grew thick, replaced by the ghost scent of blood and gunpowder, bringing back a memory he had tried to bury. He was not in the cellar anymore. He was in a stuffy, smoke-filled barracks in 1916. An officer was boasting, his voice a guttural drone, about the butchers and thieves who had been cleansed from the occupied lands. Dimitar could feel the metallic taste of blood in his mouth as the man described the execution of Serbian intellectuals, the very people who were his counterparts, his friends from a world he had lost forever. He heard the officer's cold, triumphant words, "We must erase all traces of them, destroy any evidence they ever existed." He felt the chilling realization that it was not just a war of armies, but a war against memory, a deliberate policy of Bulgarization and ethnic cleansing designed to crush a culture and a people. A rough hand on his shoulder pulled him back to the present. "Found them." Atanas's voice was a low growl. "Take them outside, Petrov." Dimitar felt the eyes of the Serbian family on him, their hope flickering like a candle in the darkness. He had seen this look before, in the empty eyes of the men he had been told were traitors and insurgents. He looked at the family, then at Atanas. The lieutenant's face was an expressionless mask, his eyes cold and devoid of pity. "Their men will be executed," Atanas stated, his voice flat, emotionless. "The women and children will be taken for processing. That is our standing order." Dimitar's blood ran cold. He had to make a choice. The memory of Surdulica was a living thing inside him, a hot, screaming protest. He could not stand by and watch this happen. Not again, not to a man who, like him, carried a book of poems in his hands. "No," Dimitar said, his voice a low, tremulous whisper, barely audible over the wind. Atanas's cold eyes widened, a flicker of genuine surprise in their depths. The sound of the wind, the low rumble of the distant artillery, and the frantic heartbeat of the family in the cellar suddenly vanished, replaced by a deafening silence. A silence that would soon be broken by a choice that would determine not only their fate, but the fate of the memory they all carried. The time for whispering was over.
Dimitar's no hung in the air, a small, fragile word in a world built for violence. It was a sound so out of place, so deeply human, that it seemed to reverberate long after he spoke it. Lieutenant Atanas stared at him, his face a mask of disbelief and contempt. His eyes, cold as a winter lake, narrowed. "Petrov," he said, the name a hard, metallic taste on his tongue. "You are an officer in the Bulgarian army. Your duty is to the crown, to the nation, not to sentiment." He gestured toward the frightened family in the cellar, a wave of his hand dismissing their existence as a minor inconvenience. "This is war. This is what we do to secure our future. We are not here to debate the morality of our mission." Atanas saw in Dimitar not just a weak-willed intellectual, but a betrayal of the very principles he believed in. This wasn't just a simple disagreement. It was a clash of two irreconcilable worldviews. He turned to Private Ivan, his voice now a low, commanding growl. "Private, take the prisoners. Lead them to the rally point. We will join you shortly." Ivan, caught between the two men, looked at Dimitar, then at Atanas. His blue eyes, usually so vacant and passive, were alive with a panicked confusion. He was a man of the earth, a farmer who understood the seasons and the toil of the fields,
not the complex moral calculus of war. His loyalty was simple and direct. Follow orders and survive. He had been told by the state that the Serbs were insurgents and traitors and that they had to be cleansed from the occupied lands. But the face of the Serbian father, a man like his own, made that simple narrative crumble. "I will not execute them," Dimitar stated, his voice now firm, a tremor still present but buried under a new resolve. "I cannot." Atanas sneered, a flash of white teeth in the gloom. "You will not have to. That will be handled at the command post. For now, you will follow my orders and ensure these civilians are contained. The enemy is pushing. We have to move." As Atanas and his portion of the patrol began to advance, Dimitar was left alone with Ivan and the family. A palpable tension filled the air. Ivan's hands gripped his rifle so tightly his knuckles were white. Dimitar took a step toward the young soldier, his voice low and urgent. "Ivan, look at them. Look at their hands. They are not soldiers. They are farmers, teachers, like me." He pointed to the book the Serbian father still held. "He is a man of words. Just like I was, just like the men of Surdulica." The name hung there, a ghost in the cold air. The Surdulica massacre was not an official event, not a line in the military record that Atanas would ever acknowledge. For Atanas, it was a necessary cruelty, an event that had to be justified and forgotten. But for Dimitar, it was the opposite. It was a trauma that had to be remembered, a wound that had to be tended to. It was the reason he was here, the driving force behind the letters he wrote and the diary he kept hidden in his jacket. The weight of it felt immense, a physical burden against his chest. It wasn't just paper and ink. It was the final testament of forgotten souls, a last stand against the official history that insists on cleaning its crimes. Dimitar's mind flashed back to the moment he had first heard of the atrocities, a morbid curiosity in a newspaper article that described the kamikazes and paramilitary groups working with the regular army to brutalize civilians. He saw again in his mind's eye the chilling account of officers boasting about taking spades into the mountains to dig graves for prisoners who never returned. He felt the icy dread in his stomach, the same dread that now filled him as he looked at the frightened Serbian family. The weight of his diary in his pocket was the only thing grounding him, a physical reminder of his self-imposed mission. He looked at Ivan, searching for a flicker of recognition, a sign of shared humanity. "You have a family, Ivan. A wife? A mother?" Ivan nodded, his throat tight. He avoided Dimitar's gaze. "A mother and a sister. They are waiting for me." "And what will you tell them when you return?" Dimitar pressed, his voice soft. "That you followed orders? That you helped bring this destruction to a family just like ours?" Ivan looked down at the mud, his boots sinking slowly into the earth. The silence between them was punctuated by the distant rhythmic boom of artillery, the sound growing louder, closer. It was the sound of the front collapsing, of the war finally reaching its violent, inevitable end. The urgency of their situation was no longer a theoretical concern, but a living, breathing monster on the horizon. The very ground seemed to vibrate with each concussion. "My orders are to take them to the rear," he mumbled, his voice thick with confusion. "And what happens there?" Dimitar asked, knowing the answer. "Do you think they will be treated with compassion, or with the same brutality that killed the men of Surdulica?" He let the words hang there, sharp as a shrapnel shard. He knew he was asking the boy to make a choice between his duty to the army and his duty to his own conscience.
The moral conflict was not just Dimitar's to bear, but Ivan's as well. The young boy raised his head, and for the first time looked directly at Dimitar. His blue eyes no longer vacant, but filled with a profound sadness. He saw the truth in Dimitar's trembling hands and in the quiet desperation in his eyes. He saw the face of a man who was fighting a war not for land or for glory, but for his very soul. And in that moment, he realized that Dimitar's fight was also his own. The mud on the boots, the ache in the bones, the hunger in the belly, all of it was nothing compared to the weight of a guilty conscience. They were just two men, caught in a machine of destruction. Dimitar the professor was fighting it with his words. Ivan, to farmer, would have to find his own way. The air grew colder, the wind sharper, and the distant explosions were no longer a distant rumble, but a present threat. The ground shook beneath them. The time for deliberation was running out.
The rhythmic rumble was no longer a distant thunder on the horizon. It had become a living, breathing entity, a monstrous sound that shook the earth beneath their feet. The air, once still and cold, now smelled of ozone and cordite, a sharp chemical scent that stung Dimitar's nostrils. The distant crump-crump of artillery fire intensified, a relentless, deafening beat that signaled not a battle, but a final, brutal ending. The ground trembled with each concussion, a living thing in its death throes, and Dimitar felt the vibration travel from the soles of his boots up through his bones, a tremor of pure, unadulterated fear. This was the Vardar offensive. This was the end. Ivan's face, already pale with confusion, was now a mask of pure terror. He clutched his rifle, his knuckles white against the dark wood. He was a boy, a farmer ripped from his land and thrown into a world he could not comprehend. He looked at Dimitar, his eyes wide and pleading, as if the professor might have a book with the answer to this chaos. Atanas, the stoic lieutenant, was the first to show the cracks. The rigid line of his back was gone, replaced by a nervous, twitching energy. His head swiveled from side to side, his eyes scanning the horizon, searching for an enemy he could not see, but could feel, pressing in on all sides. Then the first signs of the rout appeared. A solitary soldier, hatless and wild-eyed, ran past them, his chest heaving, his boots splashing through the mud. Then another, and another. Soon a steady stream of men, their faces etched with a desperate animal panic, were fleeing the front lines. The order, the discipline, the very soul of the army was dissolving into the mud. This was not an orderly retreat, it was a full-blown collapse. The Allied artillery barrage had not killed them in droves, but it had severely affected the Bulgarian esprit de corps, breaking their will to fight and leading to mass desertions. The men were not fighting for glory or for country anymore. They were running for home, running for their lives. Atanas let out a guttural cry of frustration. He aimed his rifle at a running man and fired. The sound was flat and sharp, a punctuation mark in the roaring symphony of destruction. The man fell, a heap of mud and fabric, and the others did not even flinch. They kept running. Atanas looked at Dimitar, his face twisted with rage. "This is your doing, Petrov, your weakness, your pity. You infect them with your cowardice. You do not believe in the cause." Dimitar, caught between the brutal truth of the rout and the lieutenant's irrational anger, felt a profound, weary sadness wash over him. He was tired of this war, of the forced marches and the senseless violence. He was not a weak man, he was a broken one. The weight in his pocket, his diary, felt heavier than ever, a physical reminder of the promise he had made to himself. He had to bear witness, he had to remember. Suddenly, the world exploded. A flare went up, casting a stark white light over the landscape.
Dimitar's eyes, squinting against the blinding light, saw them. The Allied troops. A mix of Serbs and French, their uniforms dark against the pale light, advancing with a terrifying professional calm. They were a force of nature, an unstoppable wave. A hail of bullets erupted. A sharp, high-pitched whistle of a round passed so close to Dimitar's ear he could feel the pressure change. He instinctively dropped to the ground, pulling Ivan down with him. Atanas, still screaming his accusations, was hit. He stumbled back, a dark red flower blooming on his chest, before falling to his knees and then face first into the mud. Dimitar's mind was racing. He was trapped. He could not fight. He could not run. He could only wait for the inevitable. The cold, wet mud seeped into his clothes, and the smell of death, hot and metallic, filled his mouth. He looked at Ivan, who was huddled beside him, his body shaking uncontrollably. The young boy's eyes were shut tight, as if he could simply wish this horror away. Dimitar's hands, still trembling, went to his jacket pocket, feeling the leather-bound book within. The diary, the one thing he had fought so hard to protect. The record of the innocents, the true story of Surdulica, the truth that the war had tried to erase, the truth that the official history would never admit. He looked at Ivan, seeing the boy not as a soldier, but as a vessel. He could not save the Serbian family he had found. He could not save himself. But he could save the memory. He grabbed the diary and the small stack of letters he had written to his wife. "Ivan," he whispered, his voice thin but clear, barely audible over the screaming and the gunfire. "Take this. Run. Now." The boy's eyes opened. He stared at the objects in Dimitar's hands, then at Dimitar's face, a silent question in his wide, terrified eyes. "You must take it," Dimitar urged, pushing the book and letters into the boy's hands. The lies will kill us all. Do not forget them. The innocent, you must not forget them." Ivan, still shaking, clutched the bundle as if it were a talisman. He looked at Dimitar, a final fleeting moment of shared understanding passing between them. Then, in the chaos, he turned and ran, a small, desperate figure disappearing into the swirling smoke and a torrent of fleeing men. Dimitar watched him go, a sense of peace washing over him, a quiet calm in the midst of the storm. He had done what he could. He had given his final message. He was just a teacher, a man of words. But his words would not die with him. He heard a sound, a boot landing heavily in the mud beside him. He looked up, his glasses askew, and saw a face. Not a Bulgarian face, not a Serbian face, just a face, caked in mud, its eyes cold and empty. Dimitar did not beg. He did not cry. He simply closed his eyes and waited for the darkness. His last thought, a quiet prayer that the memory he had saved would be a light in the endless dark.
The world dissolved into a maelstrom of screaming and gunfire. Ivan did not look back. He ran, his lungs burning, the mud sucking at his boots with every panicked step. He was a small, insignificant figure in a chaotic torrent of men, a river of humanity in full retreat. The air was thick with the stink of smoke and fear, the scent of a dying army. Above him, flares arced through the bruised sky, illuminating the panicked faces of men who had thrown away their rifles, their packs, their very identities in a desperate race to nowhere. The sound of bullets whizzing past his ears was a constant, terrifying symphony. But all he could hear was Dimitar's last plea: "Do not forget them, the innocent." The words were not just a command, they were a burden, a physical weight in his trembling hands. The small, leather-bound diary and the stack of letters were slippery with mud and sweat, but he held them tightly, a talisman against the madness. He was no hero. He was just a boy from a farm, running from a war he never understood. His only thought was to get home, to the quiet safety of his family. But Dimitar's words and the weight of the diary had planted a new seed in his mind. He was no longer running from something, but for something. He ran for miles, through forests where the shadows seemed to twist and writhe, past corpses half buried in the mud, their vacant eyes staring up at the indifferent sky. He ran until his legs ached and his vision blurred, a small, desperate figure carrying the silent testimony of a man who had chosen to die rather than be silent. The rain came down, a cold, miserable drizzle that turned the mud into a soup. Ivan, exhausted, stumbled into a small, ruined church, the stone walls offering a fragile refuge from the storm of lead and panic. He sank to the floor, his head bowed, the diary and letters clutched to his chest. He was alone now. The screaming and gunfire had faded into the distance. The silence was not peaceful, but heavy and oppressive, filled with the ghosts of the battle he had just survived. He looked at the diary, at the elegant, sloping handwriting that belonged to a world of books and ideas, a world so far removed from this hell. He could not read the words, but he knew what they held: the truth. A truth that was dangerous, a truth that got a good man killed. For a moment, he considered burying it, hiding it from a world that had no place for such things. He looked at the pages, now stained with mud, a part of the earth he had fought to save, and a part of the truth he had been commanded to carry. He buried it, not to hide it, but to protect it, to give it a chance to outlive the war. Years passed. The war ended. The mud of the Macedonian Front dried and was covered by grass. The memory of the war, like the bodies, was buried. Official histories were written, treaties were signed, and the world tried to forget the horrors it had inflicted upon itself. The story of the Bulgarians, of their role in the war, was simplified into a footnote of defeat. The names of Surdulica and countless other atrocities were relegated to dusty reports to be ignored by a world eager to move on. But some memories refused to be buried. Years later, a farmer was tilling his field, near the site of the old Macedonian Front. His plow struck something hard, a small, leather-bound book, its cover warped and stained, its pages sealed shut by layers of mud. It was the color of dried blood and forgotten earth. He cleaned it, his fingers tracing the faint, almost illegible inscription on the cover. He took it to a local historian, an old man who had spent his life trying to salvage the forgotten stories of the war. His heart ached because this could be the book that he had been looking for. The historian carefully, reverently pried the book open. The pages, brittle and fragile, were filled with a looping, elegant script. It was a diary, and the final pages, a set of letters, were an act of witness, a final confession. The voice of Dimitar Petrov, the professor who had been a soldier, spoke from beyond the grave. His words, written in the frantic, desperate moments before his death, recounted the horrors he had seen. He wrote of the senseless cruelty, of the casual brutality, of the policy of Bulgarization that sought to erase all traces of the culture of a people. He wrote of a family he had found in a cellar, a father who was a teacher just like him. He wrote of the massacre of Surdulica, of the men who were his peers, his friends, his intellectual brothers, who had been killed simply for being Serbian. He wrote of his own terror and the shame he felt for the actions of his countrymen. But his final words were not of despair. They were a plea for memory. Let no one forget the innocent, not even the history that insists on cleansing its crimes. The diary of Dimitar Petrov became a living document, a counter-narrative to the official story.
It was the voice of all the forgotten souls, the innocent victims who had no one to tell their story. Dimitar, the teacher, had died not as a soldier, but as a martyr for the truth. His physical body was buried, forgotten, lost to the earth, but his final defiant act of writing had given him a kind of immortality. He was now, and forever, the voice of the Black Danube. His story, told in the pages of a mud-cocked diary, ensured that the pain of the past would not be forgotten, that even in the midst of a world of violence, a single man's faith in the power of words could endure, a light in the darkest of places.